His left hand would not close. He had been standing in the doorway for less than 4 minutes, and already the cold had done this, had reached inside his glove, found the tendons in his fingers, and locked them. The buckle on his snowshoe harness sat in his palm like a piece of sculpture he could look at but not touch. He stared at it. He had buckled this same harness 400 times. His fingers did not care. The thermometer nailed to the outside wall read -68 degrees Fahrenheit. He had seen -40 degrees Fahrenheit before in Minnesota, the winter he turned 19. That kind of cold had felt like a punishment. This kind did not feel like anything so human as punishment. This was something older and something that did not have an opinion about him at all. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel if you enjoy these stories. Write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I always find it fascinating to see people from around the world united by one story. The date was February 7th, 1935. The man's name was Elias Cord. He was 34 years old. He was standing in the doorway of a hand-built cabin in interior Alaska, and he was trying to decide whether a 400-yard walk was worth the risk of dying. Not the risk of being uncomfortable, not the risk of a bad day, the risk of dying. At -68 degrees Fahrenheit, exposed skin, the strip of forehead between a hat and a face wrap, the quarter-inch of wrist between a glove and a sleeve, dies in under 90 seconds. It does not hurt at first. That is the part no one tells you. Frostbite in its early stages is completely painless. The tissue simply goes numb, then white, then hard, like the fat on a cold cut of meat. The pain comes later when the blood tries to return, and by then the damage is already done. Elias had learned this the previous November, when he made the mistake of checking his outer trap set without fully sealing his left cheekbone. The skin there was still a slightly different color, paler, tighter, a permanent reminder. 40 yards out from his cabin door, he had a woodpile. 400 yards out, he had a trap. The trap was the reason he was standing in the doorway at all, working his stiff fingers against a buckle that would not move, trying to calculate whether what was in that trap, if anything was in it, was worth the walk. He had not checked that particular set in 11 days. The cold had kept him inside or kept him to the short loop, the closer sets, the ones he could reach and return from before the cold turned from dangerous to fatal. The far trap had been sitting there, unattended, for 11 days in the coldest February interior Alaska had recorded in 4 decades. He had not seen direct sunlight in 53 days, not a glimpse, not a slant of it through the trees. The sun rose at this latitude in February, technically, but it came up low and brief and orange, like something embarrassed by itself, and it was gone before it cleared the ridgeline to the south. Most days it was hidden behind cloud cover entirely, and Elias moved through a world that was perpetually the color of a sheet of old paper, pale, flat, directionless. Shadows did not fall at noon. Everything was just slightly less dark than it had been an hour before, and then slightly more dark than it would be an hour later, and then it was night again. The nights lasted 19 hours. He got the buckle. His fingers found it not through feeling. He could not feel them, but through memory and mechanics, the way a pianist finds a key in the dark. The harness clicked. He pulled the strap tight against his boot with his palm, the way a man with no grip strength learns to do a job that requires grip strength. He stepped outside and pulled the door shut behind him. The cold hit his face like a wall. Not a wind. There was no wind, which was almost worse. Wind at least gave the cold a direction, called a This cold simply existed in every cubic inch of air, pressing against every surface with the same flat indifference. He had read once, in a pamphlet distributed by the Alaska Road Commission, that at minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit and below, the air itself becomes thinner in a certain sense. The moisture in it freezes and falls out, and what is left is drier than any desert air, so dry it pulls moisture directly from the lining of your lungs. Trappers called it burning dry. It felt like breathing in through a lit match, a sensation he had first encountered in December and had not grown accustomed to since. He breathed through his nose, always through his nose. The nasal passages were designed to warm air before it reached the lungs, and at minus 68 degrees Fahrenheit, that function was not optional. 53 days since the sun had done him any good. 53 days of moving through a world that operated entirely without warmth, without color in the usual sense, without the ordinary biological signal that told a human body what time it was and what it should feel. His sleep had fractured in November. He fell asleep by 7 each evening and was awake by 3 in the morning, lying in the dark cabin listening to the logs creak and pop as the cold pressed against them from outside. He ate by lamplight. He worked by whatever the sky offered. He had started in January talking to his dog not as a habit but as a need, because the dog was the only other living thing within 30 miles that breathed. The dog was named Pepper. Pepper was a female husky Malamute mix, black and grey, with one blue eye and one brown one, and she was currently sitting in the snow 10 yards from the cabin door, watching Elias strap on his snowshoes with an expression of professional evaluation. She had been watching him do this for 2 winters. She knew what the snowshoes meant. She was deciding whether the signs were good. He looked at her. She looked at him. He decided to go. The walk to the far trap took him 22 minutes in good conditions, meaning conditions that were merely dangerous rather than fatal. That morning it took him 31. He moved slowly, deliberately, with the particular economy of motion that extreme cold demands. No wasted movement, no unnecessary exertion, because sweat was the other great killer out here. A man who worked too hard in extreme cold would sweat inside his clothing, and sweat in extreme cold soaked through layers, destroyed insulation, and turned a warm body into a cold one in the time it took the exertion to stop. The old-timers had a rule: never work hard enough to sweat. Never. Move at the pace of a man who has nowhere to be. Elias had somewhere to be. He moved like a man who did not. The trail through the spruce was packed by his own previous trips. A narrow groove in the snow, 3 feet deep in places, flanked on both sides by trees so loaded with ice that their branches angled downward like the arms of exhausted men. The snow did not squeak underfoot the way it did at warmer temperatures. At minus 68 degrees Fahrenheit, it made a sound more like breaking glass. A fine, sharp crunch with each step, continuous, precise, like someone slowly destroying something delicate. He did not stop. Stopping was a decision with consequences out here. The trap was a number 3 new house, a steel leg-hold trap with a jaw spread of about 5 inches, set for marten, the small, dark-furred animal whose pelt was worth more per pound than almost anything else on the line. He had set it at the base of a leaning birch covered with a spruce bough and a dusting of snow, baited with a piece of dried fish he had packed from the cabin in October. Setting a trap in October in Alaska was an act of optimism. You were laying down money in the form of labor and materials on the belief that you would be alive and functional enough to collect on it 4 months later. He reached the tree, The trap had fired. Something had been in it. Past tense. Because what he found when he brushed the snow away was not an animal and not an empty trap. It was a sprung mechanism with the bait gone and the pan depressed, and a single dark smear on the inside of one jaw that told him an animal had been caught here for some unknown number of days in -68 degrees Fahrenheit cold, and had eventually freed itself, or been freed by something else. He stood over the empty trap for a long moment. He had walked 31 minutes in the coldest air he had ever stood in, burning calories he could not easily replace, spending time at the far edge of what his body could sustain, and the trap was empty. The bait was gone. The catch was gone. 11 days of waiting, 11 days of cold, and the only evidence left was that smear on the jaw, which told him nothing useful except that he had been here and he had been too late. He reset the trap. He replaced the bait. He turned and began the 31-minute walk back. Here is what he did not know, standing there in the spruce with the empty trap in his hands. This was not the worst thing that would happen to him this winter. It was not close to the worst. The cold pressing against his face at that moment, the -68 degrees Fahrenheit air that was already working on the exposed skin above his left eyebrow, was not the real enemy. The real enemy was something he had built himself with his own hands in his own best judgment back in October. Something he was counting on, something that would not be there when he went to find it. He didn't know that yet. He walked back through the breaking glass snow, Pepper falling into step 3 feet behind him, and the spruce closed over the trail behind them both, and the pale February sky offered nothing, no warmth, no light worth the name, no indication that there was a sun somewhere above all that grey that had not forgotten this particular latitude entirely. To understand how a man ends up making that calculation, walk or don't walk, live or maybe die, and choosing to walk every single time, you have to understand the world that made him think this was a reasonable life. Alaska in 1935 was not a state. It was not even close to being a state. That would not happen for another 24 years. It was a territory which in practice meant it was a place the federal government owned but did not particularly manage, a land mass larger than Texas, California, and Montana combined, administered from Washington by people who had never stood in it and could not have found the Yukon Flats on a map without help. The population of the entire territory was under 60,000 people. To put that number in physical terms, if you took those 60,000 people and distributed them evenly across Alaska's 663,000 square miles, each person would have 11 square miles to themselves. 11 square miles of spruce forest, tundra, river ice, and mountain. 11 square miles with no roads, no telephone lines, no neighbors within walking distance. That was the average. In the interior of the vast, flat, river-braided middle of Alaska where Elias Cord ran his trap line, the actual density was far lower than that average suggested. Some men went months without seeing another face. The economy that pulled people into this emptiness was fur. Specifically, the pelts of animals that lived in the boreal forest, the marten, the mink, the lynx, the beaver, the wolf, the wolverine, animals whose winter coats were thick enough and fine enough that wealthy buyers in New York, London, and Paris would pay extraordinary sums to wear them. A single prime marten pelt in 1935 sold for between $3 and $6 at the trading post, which sounds modest until you understand that a working man in the American Midwest was earning perhaps $8 a week, and a skilled trapper running a productive line could bring in 300 pelts in a season. The math worked, barely, and only if everything went right, but it worked. What it required was winter. The animals' coats were only prime quality when the cold had fully set in, October through March, the months when the fur thickened to its maximum density and depth. This was not incidental to the story of Alaskan trapping, it was the whole story. The fur trade was built entirely on the fact that the most valuable product was available only during the most dangerous season, in the most remote locations, accessible only to people willing to live inside that danger for months at a time. The trading posts were the nodes of this system, places like Fort Yukon, Tanana, Galena, small settlements on the river bends where a trapper could buy supplies in fall, sell his catch in spring, and conduct the entirety of his economic life in 2 brief windows separated by a winter of absolute solitude. The trader at each post was often the only person a trapper dealt with for the entire year. He was banker, merchant, postmaster, and doctor, frequently all at once, with the qualifications of none. A trap line was not a line in the way a road is a line, a thing you walk from one end to the other. It was a loop, carefully designed, sometimes 200 miles around, with trap sets positioned every half mile to 2 miles depending on the terrain and the target species. The trapper walked this loop continuously through winter, checking each set, resetting the ones that had fired, replacing bait, adjusting pan sensitivity, clearing snow. A single pass around the full loop took between 2 and 3 weeks on snowshoes or by dog sled. By the time a trapper reached the end of the loop, it was time to start again. This meant a trapper spent most of winter walking, not hiking in the recreational sense. Walking with weight, a pack of 60 to 80 pounds, tools, bait, food for the days away from the main cabin, a rifle, replacement trap hardware. Walking in temperatures where stopping for more than a few minutes required immediate shelter. Walking in darkness for half the day, navigating by memory and landmark and the faint blue-grey light that passed for afternoon in January. The snowshoes themselves, wide, wood-framed, laced with rawhide, added 2 pounds per foot, and required a gait that was part shuffle, part swing, utterly unlike normal walking, burning muscle groups in the hips and inner thighs that no other activity used in quite the same way. Within a week on snowshoes, a new man's thighs looked like he had been in a fight. After a month, he moved differently. His stride widened, his weight shifted forward, his pace became something between a walk and a controlled fall, the body adapting to the only mechanics that worked out here. Most of the men who came to interior Alaska in this era were not born trappers. They were veterans of the First World War, many of them, men who had come back from France or the Pacific, changed in ways they could not explain to anyone who had not been there, men who found that rooms felt too small and crowds felt threatening, and the ordinary rhythms of American life had somehow become unbearable. Alaska offered the thing they could not name: distance from other people, from noise, from the specific texture of a world that no longer felt like it belonged to them. Others came because they had failed at something else, a farm, a marriage, a business. And Alaska was the last place the failure hadn't reached yet. Others came because the government had printed pamphlets, optimistic documents full of phrases like unlimited opportunity and fertile territory, written by people who had visited Alaska in July and not appreciated the significance of what July meant there. A very small number came because they genuinely wanted this life, the specific, particular life of solitude and cold and the daily problem of survival, and found, once they arrived, that wanting it and living it were two different things entirely. By 1935, most of the men who had come for the wrong reasons were already gone. The ones who stayed had learned certain things that no pamphlet mentioned. They had learned that the Yukon River, which looked like a road on a map, froze to 6 feet thick by December and was the primary highway of interior Alaska for the entire winter. Dog teams, supply sleds, mail carriers all traveling on its surface, navigating by the pressure ridges and open leads that made the ice treacherous in ways you had to know personally to avoid. They had learned that the temperature did not drop gradually the way it did in the lower 48. It dropped suddenly overnight, 40 degrees in 12 hours, catching the unprepared in conditions they had not dressed for. They had learned that the darkness was not merely the absence of light, but a physical condition with weight to it, something that pressed on the human nervous system in ways that accumulated over weeks into something that wasn't quite madness, but wasn't quite not madness either. And they had learned one other thing, the thing that mattered most: the cold above the Arctic Circle operated by different rules than any cold they had encountered before. Below roughly -50 degrees Fahrenheit, the behavior of materials changed in ways that were not intuitive. Steel became brittle, not weak, but actually brittle, the molecular structure of the metal shifting so that a steel tool struck at the wrong angle would shatter rather than bend. Rubber cracked, leather stiffened to the consistency of wood. Kerosene, the standard fuel for lamps and some stoves, thickened toward gel as temperatures dropped past -55 degrees Fahrenheit, and below -65 degrees Fahrenheit it would not flow through a wick at all. The guns that men carried for safety, for protection against moose, for hunting, for the basic security of having a firearm in the wilderness, jammed at extreme temperatures because the lubricating oil in their mechanisms froze solid. The tools a man had built his survival around stopped working. Every system a trapper designed, every carefully thought-out process for staying warm, staying fed, staying alive, was calibrated for the cold that statistics suggested he would face. The average January low in interior Alaska was around -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Brutal, but manageable with the right preparation. Men had been surviving it for decades. What the averages did not account for was the year that was not average. The winter of 1934 into 1935 was not average. It was something that came along rarely enough that most working trappers had never seen it and had no framework for it. The temperatures that descended on the Yukon flats that January were not -40 degrees Fahrenheit. They were not even -50 degrees Fahrenheit. The thermometer at the weather station in Fort Yukon, 60 miles from Elias Cord's cabin, recorded -70 degrees Fahrenheit on January 14, 1935, and the mercury stayed below -60 degrees Fahrenheit for 11 consecutive days. At those temperatures, the Yukon River did not just freeze, it sang, a deep, resonant booming that traveled for miles as the ice contracted and expanded under thermal stress, a sound that men who heard it for the first time mistook for distant artillery, and men who knew what it was found no less alarming. The spruce trees exploded, not metaphorically. The sap inside them froze, expanded, and split the wood with a crack like a rifle shot, audible in the silence from a quarter-mile away. In the first week of that cold snap, Elias counted 9 such explosions from his cabin. He stopped counting after that. None of this by itself would have been unsurvivable for a man as experienced and well-supplied as Elias Cord. The cold was the thing everyone saw. The cold was the thing that got into every account of Alaskan winters, every letter sent south, every story told at the trading post in spring. But the men who had actually spent winters in the interior knew that the cold by itself was rarely what killed you. What killed you was the thing the cold exposed, the miscalculation, the oversight, the single assumption you had built your entire plan around that turned out to be wrong. Elias had made such an assumption. He had made it in October carefully with full attention, drawing on 2 years of experience and everything he had read and been told. It was a reasonable assumption. It was the assumption any experienced man would have made. It was wrong in a way he would not discover until December, standing in the snow 6 miles from his cabin, and by then the temperature had already dropped to a point where the mistake could not be corrected. But that is getting ahead of the story. Before the winter, before the miscalculation, before the 53 sunless days and the frozen buckle and the empty trap, there was the man himself. There was October, and there was the last afternoon of open water on the river, and there was Elias Cord standing on the bank, watching the first skim of ice form at the edges, knowing exactly what that ice meant, knowing it the way you only know something after you have spent 2 winters learning it the hard way. He was ready. He believed he was ready. He had never been more wrong about anything in his life. Elias Cord was born in 1901 in a town called Bemidji, Minnesota, which sits at the edge of the northern boreal forest and gets cold enough in January that the locals stop remarking on it. He grew up understanding cold the way children who grow up near water understand swimming, not as a skill acquired, but as a condition absorbed. His father ran a small lumber operation. His mother kept a kitchen garden until the frosts made it not worth the effort, which in northern Minnesota was approximately 8 months of the year. He was not a remarkable boy in any way that people recorded. What the records do show is that he enlisted in the army in 1917 at 16, lying about his age with enough confidence that no one looked too carefully, and that he was in France by 1918, and that he came back in 1919 without a scratch on his body and without ever speaking about what he had seen there to anyone who asked. His sister wrote in a letter preserved in a county historical archive that the brother who returned from France moved differently than the one who left. Quieter, she wrote, and more careful with everything, as though he had learned to treat ordinary objects with a respect that bordered on suspicion. He spent the 1920s doing what a lot of men with that particular history did, moving. Minnesota to Wisconsin, Wisconsin to Montana, Montana to British Columbia, working logging camps and survey crews, and one winter on a commercial fishing boat out of Prince Rupert that he never discussed afterward. He was not running from anything, as far as anyone could determine. He was looking for the right scale of world at a place that was large enough that the edges of it were not visible from the middle. He arrived in Alaska in 1931. A government land program offered trappers the right to register a trap line, to formally claim a specific route through the wilderness as their operational territory, which gave them legal standing to work that land without competition from other registered trappers. The program cost nothing to enter. The requirements were simple. You had to physically survey and mark your intended line, submit a map to the territorial office in Fairbanks, and demonstrate that you had the equipment and experience to operate it safely. Elias submitted his map in September 1931. The line he drew covered 214 miles through the Yukon Flats north and west of Fort Yukon, through spruce forest and river-bottom willow thickets that he had scouted by canoe that summer. He had 47 trap sets on that line. He knew the location of each one the way a watchmaker knows the position of every gear, not by consulting a diagram, but by feel, by accumulated repetition, by a spatial memory that had been built over 2 full winters of walking the same loop. His main cabin sat at the center of the loop. It was a structure he had built himself in the summer of 1931 from spruce logs he felled within a quarter-mile of the site. Small, roughly 12 feet by 14 feet inside, low-ceilinged, because heat rose, and a low ceiling kept more of it at body level. The walls were chinked with a mixture of moss and mud that he repacked every fall. The floor was split logs laid flat. There was a cast-iron stove that weighed 140 pounds and had been transported upriver by canoe in pieces, which was one of the more physically demanding things Elias had done in a life that included a fair amount of physically demanding things. A single window covered in winter with a piece of scraped animal membrane that let in light without letting in cold. Glass was available but heavy, and Elias had made the calculation that the weight was not worth the clarity. The photograph nailed to the wall above the stove showed a woman and 2 children standing in front of a white house somewhere in the Midwest, squinting into summer sun. It was not a photograph of his family. He had found it tucked inside a second-hand book he bought at a trading post in Fort Yukon, and he kept it not out of sentiment for people he didn't know, but because a human face was a specific kind of anchor, and in a cabin 180 miles from the nearest settlement, anchors mattered. He had one dog, Pepper. He had acquired her from a Koyukon Athabascan family near Tanana in the spring of 1932, paying $12 and a steel trap for her, which the man he bought her from indicated was a fair price by the standards of a dog who had already bitten 2 people but was exceptional on a harness line. Elias had found both claims to be accurate. Pepper had bitten him once in the first month, when he reached for her food bowl without warning, once, and never again, because after that first time he always announced himself, and she always acknowledged the announcement. And between them they arrived at a set of protocols that functioned well enough that by the second winter he trusted her judgment about weather more than he trusted his own. Dogs in the interior had a capacity for reading atmospheric pressure that experienced mushers swore by. When Pepper pressed herself against the cabin door and refused to move, Elias had learned to check the thermometer and then recheck it an hour later, because the temperature was usually still dropping. She was right about this with a consistency that defied easy explanation. His supply system had been built with the precision of something he had spent 2 years refining. In September, before freeze-up, he ran his canoe up each of the 3 main cache sites along the trap line, positions chosen for their centrality, to different sections of the loop, so that he would never be more than 2 days' travel from stored food. He packed dried moose meat, rendered fat, which in extreme cold was the single most calorie-dense food available, and which experienced northern travelers treated as currency. Dried beans, rolled oats, salt, tea, and the hard, dense pilot bread that kept indefinitely in cold and could be eaten, frozen if necessary. The main cache, 6 miles from the cabin on the eastern branch of the loop, held 300 pounds of food. Enough, by his calculations, to carry him through a full winter, even if hunting was poor. He buried it in permafrost. Permafrost is the layer of soil beneath the surface of the ground in subarctic and Arctic regions that never thaws, not in summer, not in any summer, not in any sequence of summers going back thousands of years. It was the natural refrigeration system of the north, reliably cold, reliably stable, the obvious place to store food that needed to be kept frozen and protected from animals. Every trapper used it. Every experienced man in the territory would have told you it was the right call. What experienced men also knew but did not always account for in their planning was that permafrost was not uniform. It shifted. Specifically, it shifted in response to changes in the surface above it, changes in vegetation, in drainage patterns, in the particular weight and distribution of snow in a given year. A cache site that was solid and stable in year 1 might develop a slow lateral movement by year 3 as the permafrost layer beneath it adjusted to conditions it had not previously encountered. The movement was not dramatic, it was not visible from the surface. It happened at a rate measured in inches per season, which was enough, over 2 years, to open small channels in the surrounding soil. Channels that water could enter, channels that water could then fill and freeze and fill again, building a slow accretion of ice around whatever the permafrost was holding. Elias had dug his main cache in the fall of 1932. By the fall of 1934, he had restocked it twice without incident, using the same technique in the same location. There was no reason from the surface to suspect anything had changed. The marker stick he had driven into the ground above the cache was where he had left it. The snow over the site looked undisturbed. He thought about that cache through all of October and November, the way a man thinks about money in a bank account, not constantly, but with a background sense of security that shaped every other decision. The food was there. The food was enough. Whatever the winter threw at him, the food was enough. In September, before he sealed himself in for the season, he wrote a letter. He wrote it in his log, the journal he kept in a hardcover composition book, one of 4 he had brought from Fairbanks. And the letter was addressed to no one specific, which was the detail about it that said the most. It covered 4 pages. It described the trapline, the cabin, the condition of the river, his plans for the coming months. It noted that Pepper seemed in good health and that the marten sign in the eastern section of the loop was the best he had seen in 3 years. It expressed, in the straightforward and non-dramatic language of a man who had made a decision and was not second-guessing it, that he was prepared for winter and expected a productive season. He did not mail this letter because the last mail carrier of the season had come and gone in late August, and the next would not arrive until April. He kept it in the composition book. He kept writing in the book every few days, and the letter became the first entry in what would eventually be a record of the strangest and hardest winter of his life. The last line of that September entry read, "Everything is in order." He wrote it, and then he read it back, and something about reading it back made him close the book and go outside and stand for a while looking at the river, which was still open, still moving, still the color of slate under a cloudy afternoon sky. Pepper sat beside him. The current pushed small circles of foam downstream. He watched the water for a while, doing nothing, and then went inside and started the stove. 3 weeks later, the river was ice. 6 weeks after that, the temperature dropped to a point where everything he had prepared for became irrelevant, because what was coming was not the winter he had prepared for. What was coming had not been seen in interior Alaska in 4 decades, and it arrived without announcement, without any particular warning sign, just a thermometer that went down and kept going and stopped at a number he had never seen on any thermometer anywhere. He looked at that number. He looked at it for a long time. And then he began calculating with very great care what it meant for every single plan he had made. October was normal. Cold arrived on schedule. The first hard freeze in the 2nd week, the river beginning to skin over at the edges by the 20th, the ground locked solid by Halloween. Elias ran his early trap sets in temperatures between -15 degrees Fahrenheit and -25 degrees Fahrenheit, which was exactly what 3 years of October in the Yukon flats had taught him to expect. Pepper moved well on the frozen ground. The marten sign he had noted in September proved accurate. The first 2 weeks of the line produced 17 pelts, which was the strongest October opening he had recorded. November tightened, -30, -35. He adjusted his routine the way a watchmaker adjusts for temperature change, small calibrations, nothing structural. He added a second wool layer under his canvas outer shell. He started warming his trap-setting tools against the stove before heading out, because cold metal transferred heat out of bare hands faster than insulated metal, and bare hands were something he could not afford. He moved his morning departure 30 minutes later to take advantage of the thin grey light that passed for dawn, and he moved his return 30 minutes earlier to be inside before the temperature began its afternoon drop. Everything was working. Everything was calibrated. Then December arrived, and in the first week, the temperature dropped to -47 degrees Fahrenheit and stayed there. This was not unprecedented. Interior Alaska had seen -47 degrees Fahrenheit before, regularly, in sustained stretches. Elias had seen it himself the previous winter for a 5-day period in late January. He had managed it. He tightened the routine further, shortened the daily distance he covered, added an extra hour of wood splitting each evening to build his indoor stack. The cabin held heat adequately down to around -50 degrees Fahrenheit outside, meaning the stove could maintain roughly 60 degrees Fahrenheit inside without burning wood faster than he could split it. At -47 degrees Fahrenheit, he was uncomfortable. He was not in danger. Then December 19th came. He woke at 3 in the morning, the way he always woke, and the cabin felt different before he understood why. The stove had been banked with enough wood to last 6 hours, and it had lasted 6 hours, and the fire was still going. He could see the red glow around the stove door's edge. But the temperature inside the cabin, which he measured each morning with a small thermometer hung near the bunk, read 34 degrees Fahrenheit. The stove was running. The cabin was barely above freezing. He got up and put more wood in without stopping to dress. Then he opened the door to bring in wood from the outside stack, and the cold that entered through that open door in the 3 seconds it took him to grab an armload was different from any cold he had felt before. It had mass. It moved like water. It poured across the floor of the cabin and settled there, and Pepper, who had been sleeping near the stove, stood up immediately and pressed herself against the far wall. He checked the outside thermometer by lamplight. The mercury had dropped below the calibrated range of the thermometer, below -60 degrees Fahrenheit, which was as far down as the instrument read. He did not know exactly how far below. He would not know until weeks later when the weather station report from Fort Yukon confirmed that the night of December 19th had reached -68 degrees Fahrenheit in the flats, the beginning of a cold event that would last, with brief interruptions, through the first week of February. He stood in the doorway holding the lamp, looking at the thermometer, and understood with complete clarity that the winter he had prepared for and the winter he was now in were not the same winter. Here is what -68 degrees Fahrenheit does to a trapping operation built for -40 degrees Fahrenheit. Steel leg-hold traps, which function by a spring-loaded jaw mechanism triggered by a pressure-sensitive pan, require that the metal remain flexible enough to move. Below approximately -55 degrees Fahrenheit, the spring steel in a standard Newhouse trap loses enough elasticity that the jaw fires sluggishly. It closes, but too slowly to catch a marten's leg before the animal's reflexes pull it clear. Below -65 degrees Fahrenheit, the mechanism barely moves at all. The trap does not break. It does not malfunction in any visible way. It simply stops working, sitting in the snow, looking functional while being entirely useless, a piece of theatre that caught nothing. 47 trap sets, none of them working. This was not a setback in the way a bad week is a setback. It was an erasure. The entire income model of a trapping operation depended on the traps being set and functional and checked on a regular cycle. Without functional traps, the loop existed only as exercise, a 214-mile walk through extreme cold that produced nothing and cost an enormous amount of calories and risk to complete. There was a workaround. There was always a workaround in the north, but workarounds had costs. Snares, loops of thin wire or braided twine set at animal trail height, did not rely on spring mechanisms and continued to function at any temperature. Elias had snare wire. He had packed it as backup, not as primary, and he had enough to set perhaps a third of his normal trap positions. Snares were less selective than steel traps. They caught what passed through them rather than what was attracted to specific bait, and they required more precise placement to be effective, because the loop had to be positioned at exactly the right height and angle for the target species. He knew how to use snares. He had just never needed to run an entire line on them. He began converting his sets the next morning at -65 degrees Fahrenheit, which meant he was doing delicate wire work with hands he could not fully feel, in air that attacked exposed skin in under 2 minutes, resetting 47 positions over 3 consecutive days of travel that left him returning to the cabin each evening with the particular grey exhaustion that lived just short of the body's limit. On the third day, Pepper's front right paw began bleeding. At extreme temperatures, the pads of a sled dog's feet, which are tougher than leather in normal conditions, dry and crack the way human lips crack in dry winter air, but faster and deeper. The cracks split to the tissue beneath. The dog ran on them because she was built to run, because stopping was not in her construction, but the tracks she left in the snow on the return from that third day of conversion work were not all the same color. Some of them were pink. Elias stopped. He cut strips from an extra wool shirt he was carrying. He wrapped each of Pepper's front paws in the wool, overlapping the strips twice and tucking the ends so they would stay for the duration of the walk home. Pepper stood still for this, with the professional patience of an animal that had learned the difference between things done to her and things done for her. The booties lasted until the cabin. He needed the dog. Without her on the sled, the long sections of the loop were not impossible, but they were slower. Slow enough to change his daily range, to force him to make different choices about which sets to check and which to leave. A trapper operating alone in the interior with a compromised dog team was a trapper operating with a compromised margin. His margins were already thin. At -65 degrees Fahrenheit, his caloric burn during a full day on the trap line reached somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 calories, a figure modern sports scientists would recognize as comparable to a single stage of the Tour de France, maintained not for one day, but for every working day of the winter. His food stores, carefully calculated for a normal winter's burn rate, were based on an assumption of roughly 4,500 calories per day of active travel and 2,500 on cabin days. the extra cold was costing him an additional 1,500 to 2,500 calories every time he went out. He did the arithmetic. He did it once, got an answer he didn't like, and did it again more carefully, and got the same answer. At the current rate of consumption, his cabin stores, the food inside the cabin itself, separate from the main cache, would last through January. The main cache at the eastern branch would cover February and March. That was the plan. That was what he had built. What he had not calculated for was the question of whether the main cache would be accessible. He told himself it would be. He had checked it in October, found it solid, found the site undisturbed. He had no reason to believe otherwise. The thought that the cache might not be accessible was the kind of thought a man in his situation could not afford to examine too closely, so he filed it in the category of things that would be fine and kept moving. 3 other trappers had wintered near this part of the flats in the previous decade and had not survived the experience. Their names were recorded at the Fort Yukon trading post. 2 had died of exposure on the trapline when weather conditions shifted faster than they could manage, and 1 had simply not appeared in spring, his cabin found later with evidence of a fall and no one within range to help. Their traplines, unregistered and unclaimed after their deaths, had been absorbed into the general wilderness. Their equipment, where it was found, showed nothing unusual. Good gear, well maintained. They had done everything right. They had simply run out of the particular margin that kept doing everything right from not being enough. Elias knew their names. He had heard the stories at the trading post, in the brief spring windows when trappers overlapped and talked the way isolated men talk when given the chance, in long, detailed, practical exchanges about what worked and what hadn't, about near misses and methods, about the specific texture of decisions made at -50 degrees Fahrenheit. He thought about those names now in the second week of the cold event, standing at his easternmost trap, set and resetting the snare for the 4th time. The snare had been triggered 3 times. It had caught nothing 3 times because something had passed through it. A marten from the track pattern, at the wrong angle, hitting the loop off-center and springing it without being caught. 4th time, adjusted angle, new bait. He turned and began the walk back. Behind him, invisible in the spruce, the marten moved through its territory in the total indifference of an animal that did not know it was at the center of a man's survival calculation. It had been moving through this section of forest for 2 winters. It knew every snare Elias had ever set before he knew he was going to set it, because animals that live in one place long enough develop a map of that place more detailed than any human survey. Elias had been here 3 years. The marten had been here longer. He walked back in the dark, at night dark, but the particular mid-afternoon dark of January at 67 degrees north, the sky a deep blue-grey above the spruce tops, the temperature already dropping from its daily high of -58 degrees Fahrenheit back toward the overnight low. He had 4 miles to go. He had enough food in his pack for the walk and dinner and breakfast, which was exactly enough and no more. And somewhere 6 miles east of his cabin, under 4 feet of snow and a marker stick he had driven into the frozen ground with a hammer 2 years ago, 300 pounds of food was waiting for him. He had not checked it since October. He would need it by the end of January. He had exactly 1 month before that need became critical, and he was moving through a cold event that had already broken one of the most important pieces of his operation, and the question he had not yet asked himself, because asking it meant looking at an answer he could not act on yet, was whether everything he had buried in that permafrost was exactly as he had left it. It wasn't. He reached the cache site on December 28th. The walk from the cabin took 4 hours on snowshoes, following the eastern branch of his loop through stands of black spruce so dense that the trail narrowed to a single file channel barely wide enough for a man with a pack. Pepper broke trail ahead of him for the first 2 miles, then fell back as the packed snow gave way to fresh powder that came up to her chest and required her to lunge rather than run. The temperature that morning was -61 degrees Fahrenheit. He had started at first light, which at this latitude in December meant he had started in the dark, and the light had found him somewhere in the 2nd mile. The marker stick was exactly where he had left it. He saw it from 40 yards of a 3-foot spruce branch driven vertically into the snow, its top wrapped with a strip of red wool from a shirt he had cut up specifically for marking purposes. It stood upright, undisturbed, perfectly where he had put it 14 months ago. Everything about the site looked correct. The snow over the cache was smooth. No animal had dug here. No surface disturbance of any kind was visible. He started digging. He used a short-handled spade he had carried in his pack, working through the top 2 feet of snow quickly, then slowing as he hit the harder packed layer beneath, then slowing again as the spade struck the frozen ground. The cache was buried 3 feet down in a wooden box he had built from rough-cut spruce lumber, lined with an extra canvas tarp, folded twice for moisture protection. He had lowered the box into the hole, covered it with a second tarp weighted at the edges, and packed the excavated dirt back on top before the first freeze locked everything solid. The spade hit something at the right depth. He felt it through the handle. He cleared the snow from the surface around the strike point, exposing what should have been the edge of the tarp and the top of the box. What he found instead was ice. Not a thin skim, a solid mass of clear grey ice that extended as far as he could chip in any direction, 2 inches thick at the top and thickening as he went deeper. The tarp was in there. He could see it through the ice like an object seen through cloudy glass. And below the tarp, also encased, the outline of the box. And inside the box, the food that was supposed to carry him through February and March. He stood up. He looked at what he had. He had a spade, a hatchet, and a small pry bar he carried for frozen trap mechanisms. He had, by his estimate, 3 to 4 hours before the temperature made continued outdoor work genuinely dangerous. He set the pack down, took out the hatchet, and began. The problem with chopping ice off food is that food and ice, at -61 degrees Fahrenheit, have essentially the same hardness. The hatchet did not discriminate. Each blow that fragmented the ice also struck into whatever was directly beneath it. The tarp, the box lid, and through the box lid, the contents. After 20 minutes of work, he had cleared a section roughly the size of a dinner plate and immediately found that the dried moose meat packed in the top layer of the box had fused with the box lid in the freezing process, forming a single object he could not separate without destroying both. Pulling the meat free meant pulling it apart. Chopping deeper meant chopping through the food itself. He stopped chopping. The cold was working on his hands through 2 layers of gloves. He pressed both fists into his armpits, standing over the half-excavated cache, and ran the arithmetic he had been avoiding since the moment the spade hit ice instead of wood. In the cabin, he had 40 pounds of dried meat, 20 pounds of rendered bear fat packed in 2 birch bark containers, a 50-pound sack of dried beans, 30 pounds of rolled oats, 10 pounds of salt pork, hardtack, tea, and salt. He had a rifle with 180 rounds of ammunition. He had Pepper, who required roughly 2 pounds of food per day to maintain working condition, less if she was not pulling hard. Total caloric value of cabin stores, approximately 120,000 calories for a human, by his rough calculation. At 4,500 calories per active day in normal cold, his original planning figure, that lasted 26 days. But the cold was not normal. At -60 degrees Fahrenheit with full travel days, his actual burn was closer to 7,000 calories. At 7,000 calories per active day, alternating with cabin days at 2,500, his average burn was somewhere around 5,000 per day. At 5,000, his stores lasted 24 days. He had planned to reach this cache on day 45 of the winter season. He was already on day 51, 24 days of food. The nearest settlement was 180 miles away. March, the earliest he had planned to leave, was 62 days out. He spent 4 more hours at the cache, working methodically with the hatchet and pry bar, damaging some food, saving more, eventually extracting perhaps 60 pounds from the accessible upper layer of the box before the cold in his hands stopped being a discomfort and became a fact he could not work around. He packed the 60 pounds into his bag, added it to what he had carried out, and calculated that he had recovered roughly 20% of the cache. He marked the remaining 80% as inaccessible and did not return to that accounting. Walking back, he revised everything. The revision required cutting his daily intake to 2,200 calories, less than half the actual burn rate for heavy outdoor work in extreme cold. At 2,200 calories per day, he could stretch his stores to cover the full winter. At 2,200 calories per day, while performing the labor of running a 214-mile trap line in -60 degrees Fahrenheit temperatures, his body would begin the process that physiologists call starvation adaptation. First drawing down fat reserves, then, when those thinned, past a certain point, beginning to metabolize muscle tissue. He had no fat reserves to speak of. He was already lean from 2 months of hard outdoor work. The cabin was warm when he got back. He had banked the stove before leaving, and the iron had held heat through the day. He sat on the edge of the bunk for a while without taking his outer layers off, just sat there, and Pepper climbed up beside him uninvited, something she had never done before in 2 winters, and put her head on his thigh. He let her. The revision of his daily intake began that night. He cooked 1 cup of dried beans, a small piece of salt pork, and a tablespoon of rendered fat in the tin pot. He ate it slowly, which was not a meditation practice but a mechanical strategy. Slower eating triggered satiety signals more efficiently, meaning a smaller amount of food felt more adequate for longer. He had read this somewhere years ago, and he tested it that night and found it partially true, which was better than not true at all. He also began hunting. This sounds simple. It was not simple. Hunting in interior Alaska in January at -65 degrees Fahrenheit is a specific and demanding practice that operates nothing like the recreational version. The most available large animal was moose. A bull moose in winter carried enough meat to feed a man for 6 to 8 weeks, which would solve the caloric problem entirely. Moose moved in winter by following established trails through willow thickets, conserving energy by reusing packed paths. A hunter who knew where those trails were and who positioned himself correctly could take a moose within a few miles of his base. The problem was the cold. At -65 degrees Fahrenheit, a shot moose had to be processed. skinned, quartered, and hung, in under 4 hours, before the carcass froze solid and became impossible to work with bare hands in any reasonable time. 4 hours of close physical work on a 900-pound animal in that temperature required continuous movement to maintain body heat while simultaneously requiring the manual dexterity of a surgeon. Every Alaskan trapper knew at least one story of a man who shot a moose in extreme cold, spent too long processing it, and made errors in his own thermal management that cost him fingers or worse. A man in a caloric deficit processing a frozen moose in -65 degrees Fahrenheit was making this calculation with diminishing physical and cognitive resources. Elias went out on the 6th day after the cache discovery, following a moose trail he had found half a mile north of the cabin, and he waited at a narrows in the willows for 3 hours. The moose that came through was a cow, legal to take, but thin, clearly running its own caloric deficit through a hard winter, and he estimated her dressed weight at 400 pounds, less than half a bull. He took her anyway. He had no framework for not taking her. The processing took 4 hours and 20 minutes. He packed the meat in loads, 2 trips back to the cabin, and on the second trip his left foot stopped reporting sensation below the ankle about a mile out. He kept moving because stopping was the one option that guaranteed the outcome he was trying to avoid. The foot came back over 2 hours in front of the stove, painfully, the deep ache of returning circulation in tissue that had gone very close to the edge. He checked it carefully under lamplight. No blistering. The skin was intact. He had been, by his estimate, perhaps 30 minutes from a serious frostbite injury. He wrote in the composition book that evening, "Foot incident, adjust exposure limit, no more than 3 hours on the outer trail in this cold." 3 lines. Then he wrote down exactly how much the cow had yielded, 187 pounds of usable meat, and added it to his revised tally. He was back. Not comfortable, not safe, but back above the threshold where the math worked out. What he did not know, what he had no way of knowing from inside the cabin on a January night in interior Alaska, was that an entirely different kind of threat was already building. Not outside, not in the cold. It was building in his own body, in the tissue of his eyes, accumulating in the particular way that damage accumulates before it becomes visible, quietly, without warning, without pain, the way the worst things always come. The full moon rose on January 18th and lit the snowfield south of the cabin to a flat, brilliant white. Elias stepped outside without his eye protection. He was outside for 11 minutes, that was all. 11 minutes in the moonlight, checking the wood stack, scanning the tree line out of habit, breathing carefully through his nose in the -58 degrees Fahrenheit air that had moderated slightly from its worst. The moon was 3 days past, full and enormous in a completely clear sky, and the snowfield that opened up south of the cabin for about 400 yards before hitting the spruce wall was lit the way a photographer's studio is lit. Flat, total, sourceless. Every surface reflected back at every other surface. The snow did not just catch the light. It multiplied it. He went inside. He ate. He slept. He woke at his usual 3 in the morning and opened his eyes, and the cabin was wrong. Not dark. The stove glow was there, the familiar red line around the door. But everything beyond arm's length was a grey smear, soft and undefined, as though someone had pressed a thumb across the world. He blinked. He pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes, held them there, removed them. The grey smear remained. He lay still for a moment, not moving, running through explanations. His first thought was ice on the window membrane, condensation from the night, freezing across the interior surface, diffusing the light. He got up and touched the membrane. Clear. His second thought was smoke from a poorly drawing stove. He checked the stove. Drawing correctly, no smoke accumulation. His third thought arrived not as a thought, but as a physical sensation. A slow, dawning burn in both eyes, like sand ground into the inner lid, like the feeling of staring too long at something bright. He understood then. Snow blindness. The Athabascan trappers he had learned from in his first year had a word for it that translated roughly as the eyes that forgot to close. It was caused by ultraviolet radiation, burning the surface of the cornea, the clear dome that covered the eye, in the same way sunlight burned skin. Except the cornea had no melanin, no tanning response, no protection except the eyelid itself. UV reflected off snow with nearly the same intensity as UV coming directly from the sun, which was why experienced men in the north wore narrow slit goggles or wrapped their faces, leaving only a thin horizontal gap to see through. Moonlight reflected off clear snow was not as intense as sunlight, but 11 minutes of unprotected exposure on a clear night over a flat snowfield with light bouncing from every direction simultaneously had been enough. The medical name was photokeratitis. The burn had happened on the night of January 18th. The damage was already complete before he went to sleep. The symptoms arrived on a delay, the way a sunburn darkens hours after the exposure, and waking up blind was simply the bill coming due for something that had already happened and could not be undone. He was blind. He was alone. He was 180 miles from the nearest settlement. The first thing he did was locate Pepper by sound. She was at the foot of the bunk, shifting at the change in his movement pattern. He put his hand down and found her head. He held it there for a moment, not for her benefit. Then he got methodical. Every object in a trapper's cabin had a fixed position, and the discipline of maintaining those positions was not aesthetic preference, but functional survival architecture. The rifle hung on 2 wooden pegs to the left of the door, always. The axe leaned against the wall to the right of the stove, always. The composition book and the pencil lived on the single shelf above the bunk, always. He had built this system in his first winter not because he anticipated blindness, but because a cabin searched by lamplight in a hurry in -50 degrees Fahrenheit cold was a problem he wanted to have already solved. He moved to the stove by touch and added wood. He found the water bucket, always positioned 18 inches left of the stove base, and drank from the ladle. He found the food supply on the shelf to the left of the window and identified by shape and weight what he needed for the morning. The tin pot lived on the stove's right back corner when not in use. He made oatmeal by feel and temperature, brought the water to a rolling boil he could hear, added the oats by the measured cup he had hung on a nail specifically for portioning, timed it by counting. He ate. He kept his eyes closed, which reduced the pain from a grinding burn to a manageable throb. The treatment for photokeratitis was darkness and time. The cornea was one of the few tissues in the human body that could fully regenerate, but it needed 3 to 7 days without further UV exposure to do so. 3 to 7 days of keeping his eyes covered, staying inside, maintaining the cabin, and his own physical needs without sight, and waiting. 3 to 7 days he could not run the trap line. A trap check delayed by a week in deep winter meant animals caught and frozen solid in the traps, a loss both of the pelt, which froze, damaged, and of the set itself, which would need to be completely rebuilt. It also meant a week of zero production from the line. At his current reduced caloric intake, a week of enforced cabin rest was actually a week of marginally lower consumption. Less burning, less demand on the reserves, but it was also a week of zero hunting, and the moose meat would not last indefinitely. He made a bandage from a strip of canvas and tied it across both eyes. Then he sat down on the edge of the bunk and did nothing for a while. This was, in its way, the strangest part of the blindness, not the physical limitation, but the sudden confrontation with silence and stillness in a situation that had previously allowed him to manage his psychological state through constant movement and task completion. A man checking traps, splitting wood, cooking food, mending gear. That man was not thinking, not in the introspective sense. He was solving a continuous sequence of small physical problems, and the solving of them was itself a kind of mental occupation that left little room for the larger questions to surface. Sitting blind on a bunk in a cabin in interior Alaska in January left a great deal of room. By the second day without sight, Elias understood something that he had not fully absorbed in 3 years of solo trapping. The isolation he had chosen, had actively sought, had found in northern Minnesota to be insufficient and in Alaska to be approximately right, was a condition his body could sustain longer than his mind. The mind required a different kind of input. Not company, necessarily, not conversation, but the sense of a world that continued to exist in a form he could verify, that the cabin was real, that the trap line was real, that there was a spring coming after this winter that he would be present for. 4 days blind in a dark cabin began to erode that sense in a way that physical hardship had not touched. He began doing things with no practical purpose. He ran his fingers along the grain of the log wall beside his bunk, tracing the ridges where he had used a draw knife to smooth the bark. He tapped a sequence on the bunk frame, not a rhythm, just a sequence, and then repeated it. He found the composition book and held it, not reading, just holding the familiar weight of it, the specific texture of the cover. Pepper developed a new habit during the blindness. She moved to a position directly in front of him wherever he sat and stayed there, close enough that he could feel the heat of her body on his shins. She did not press against him. She did not require attention. She simply positioned herself as a point of reference, a fixed thing in a world that had temporarily lost its fixed points. Researchers who study prolonged solitary confinement, not in prison context but in wilderness and polar expedition context, document a consistent progression of psychological effects that begin appearing after roughly 3 weeks of social isolation. The first phase is adjustment. The mind reorganizes around the available stimuli, builds new routines, finds competence in the reduced environment. The second phase, beginning around week 4 to 6, involves what researchers call perceptual drift, a gradual loosening of the boundary between what is actually present and what the mind generates to fill the absence of external input. Men alone in remote cabins reported hearing voices in the wind that shaped themselves briefly into words. They reported the conviction that someone had just left the room. They reported conversations they had held with no one, which they remembered afterward in detail. Elias had been alone since mid-September. It was now late January. He had not reported these things in his composition book, partly because the book was a record of practical observations rather than internal states, and partly because noting them required acknowledging them, and acknowledging them led toward a set of questions he preferred not to answer. The blindness forced the questions into the open. On the third night, with the canvas strip over his eyes and Pepper's warmth at his feet, he lay in the dark and tried to remember the specific sound of a human voice. Not words, sounds. The particular resonance of a human throat producing speech, the way it filled a room differently than wind or animal noise or the creaking of frozen logs. He tried for a long time. He could recall the concept of it. He could not reconstruct the sensation. He woke on the fourth morning and removed the canvas strip and opened his eyes. Grey smear, less grey than before, less grey than... more definition at the edges. He could see the line where the log wall met the ceiling, could distinguish the stove as a separate mass from the floor around it. Not full vision, but the beginning of it, the outline of the world coming back like a photograph developing in solution. By the sixth day he could read the thermometer. On the seventh day he went outside and checked the two nearest trap sets, not because he was fully recovered, but because 7 days of lost production, added to everything else, had pushed the margin to a place he could not afford to let it go further. His eyes watered constantly in the cold air, which at least was a sign of functional tear ducts, and his vision had a persistent haziness at the periphery that would remain for another 2 weeks. He wore the narrowest eye protection he could fashion, a strip of birch bark with 2 horizontal slits cut through it, the same design the Inuit had used for centuries before manufactured goggles existed. He reached the first set. The snare had caught a marten. He held it up and looked at it, the small, dark body, the dense winter fur that had made this animal worth more than almost anything else his trapline produced. And the fact of it was a specific, locatable relief. Not the relief of the crisis being over, the relief of one correct answer in a sequence of wrong ones. He reset the snare. He moved on to the second set. What he found there was not a marten. The second set showed clear evidence of a large animal passing through, large enough that the spruce bough covering the snare had been knocked aside, the snow around the set area disturbed in a wide radius, and the snare wire itself stretched and snapped. The tracks in the snow were wolf-sized, but the pattern was wrong for a pack. Single animal, heavy by the depth of impression. Moving fast through the set and out the other side without stopping. He followed the tracks for 30 yards, reading them. Not a wolf. The gait pattern was too rolling, the toes spread too wide, the claw marks too heavy and curved. Wolverine. A wolverine had hit the set, taken whatever bait remained, destroyed the snare mechanism, and moved on with the systematic efficiency that made wolverines the most hated animal on a trap line. Not because they were dangerous to the trapper, but because they were intelligent enough to follow a trap line and methodically raid every set on it, consuming or destroying months of carefully placed work. If this wolverine had found the second set, it had possibly found others. He turned back toward the cabin, calculating which sections of his loop the animal was most likely to hit next, and he moved faster than the cold strictly allowed, and somewhere in the second mile his mind went to the far end of the line, the sets he had not been able to check in a week, the ones that were already a week behind on their cycle, the ones that sat in the eastern section where the wolverine track seemed to be heading. And then, underneath that calculation, a different one began rising. Pepper had been off her food for 2 days. He had attributed it to the cold, to the stress of the limited mobility week, to the natural fluctuation in a working dog's appetite. She had eaten yesterday, less than usual, and she had eaten without enthusiasm, which was unlike her. She had not been ill in 2 winters. She had not shown this pattern before. He looked back at her, trailing him on the trail home. Her gait was normal, her head was up, but she was moving at about 80% of her usual pace, and twice in the last mile she had stopped briefly, not to rest, but as though something in her coordination had misfired, a stumble corrected before it fully happened. He watched her for the rest of the walk. By the time the cabin came into view, he had stopped thinking about the wolverine entirely. That night, Pepper did not sleep near the stove. She had slept near the stove every night for 2 winters, not because Elias encouraged it, but because she had decided sometime in her first month in the cabin that the stove's radius was her territory, and she defended it from the cold with the same seriousness she brought to everything. The specific spot she chose was 3 feet from the iron base, on a flattened burlap sack he had eventually stopped moving because she moved it back. Every night, 2 winters. That night, she lay in the far corner of the cabin against the wall opposite the stove. Elias watched her from the bunk, but did not move her. She was breathing normally. Her eyes were open, tracking him when he shifted, which indicated neurological function of the basic kind. He told himself it was behavioral, the stress of the week, the disrupted routine, the change in her food. He had seen working dogs go off pattern before and come back without intervention. He slept. He woke at 3. He checked her. She had not moved from the corner. When he held the lamp near her, she turned her head away from the light. Slowly, with a stiffness in the neck that had not been there yesterday. He ran his hands along her spine. She flinched at the lower lumbar region, which was unusual enough that he did it again, more gently, to confirm. She flinched again. He sat back on his heels and looked at her in the lamplight. The symptoms he was observing, reduced appetite, coordination stumbles on the trail, neck stiffness, photosensitivity, the flinching at spinal pressure, assembled themselves in his mind into a pattern he recognized from a veterinary pamphlet he had read years ago at the Fort Yukon trading post, one of dozens of practical documents the post kept on a shelf for trappers who had no access to professional services. The pattern pointed to one of several neurological conditions, the most likely being distemper, a viral disease that moved through dog populations in the north with particular virulence in winter, when animals were stressed and their immune systems were suppressed. Distemper in the field in winter, 180 miles from a settlement, had one outcome. He knew this. He did not write it in the composition book that morning. He wrote the symptoms, the dates, the observations, in the careful clinical shorthand he had developed for the log. Not because anyone would ever read it, but because writing things down imposed a structure on them that kept them from expanding into the full space of what they meant. Then he went out to run the trap line alone. Running the eastern branch without Pepper meant carrying everything himself, the pack, the tools, the bait, the day's food, and moving at the pace of a man in his 5th month of reduced caloric intake in minus 57 degrees Fahrenheit air, without the psychological anchor of another living thing moving ahead of him on the trail. He had run solo sections before. He had never run them with the particular knowledge that the animal waiting back at the cabin might not be alive when he returned. The eastern section took him 7 hours. The wolverine had been there. He found the evidence at 6 of his 12 eastern sets. Snares torn free, bait gone, the surrounding snow disturbed in the unmistakable pattern of an animal that had not passed through but had stopped, worked the set deliberately, and moved on. At 2 of the sets, the wolverine had cached the bait under a nearby spruce root rather than eating it immediately, which indicated it was running the line as a regular food source rather than a chance encounter. It had learned the pattern. It knew where the sets were, 6 sets out of 12. The western branch, which he could not check until the following day, potentially had the same losses. He stood at the last destroyed set and did the calculation he had been putting off all day. His snare inventory was not unlimited. He had begun the winter with enough wire for 60 sets, which covered all 47 positions, with 13 in reserve for replacements. The Wolverine had destroyed 6 sets clean, wire stretched, loop collapsed, anchor stakes pulled. Rebuilding those sets required wire he no longer had in reserve. To rebuild all 6, he would have to cannibalize sets elsewhere on the line, pull working sets from one location to repair damaged ones in another, meaning the total number of active sets declined regardless of what he did. The trap line was contracting. Not because of the cold, not because of the cash, not because of the blindness, but because of a single animal he had not anticipated running a systematic raid on his infrastructure. February arrived the way January had refused to leave, heavy, lightless, cold, that had stopped being weather and become geography, a fixed feature of the landscape rather than a condition passing through it. The temperature moderated slightly in the first week, -48, -52. Elias registered this as relative warmth. This was what 5 weeks at -60 degrees Fahrenheit and below did to the human body's reference points. It recalibrated everything. -48 felt like a thaw. He was aware this recalibration was happening and was also unable to stop it. His weight had dropped. He could not measure it precisely, but his belt had been taken in 3 notches since October, and the 3rd notch was already loose. His face, which he checked in a piece of polished tin he used as a mirror, showed the specific sunken quality that came not from dehydration, but from subcutaneous fat depletion, the padding beneath the skin pulling back, making the orbital bones and cheekbones more prominent, aging a face faster than years did. His hands trembled slightly in the mornings before he had been near the stove for an hour. He noted this in the composition book without comment. Pepper's condition did not improve. By the 3rd day of February, she was eating less than half her usual ration, and on the 4th day, she refused food entirely, turned her head away from the meat he held in front of her, which for a working dog in winter, a dog bred for appetite in cold, was the clearest possible signal that something fundamental was wrong. She could still walk. She moved with deliberate care, placing each foot with the concentration of an animal that was no longer trusting its own coordination automatically, and she did not try to follow him when he left for the trap line. She had never, in 2 winters, stayed at the cabin voluntarily. On the 6th day of February, she had a seizure. It lasted 40 seconds. Elias was at the stove when it happened. He heard the sound of her body against the floor before he saw it, a sudden percussive thump, and turned to find her on her side, all 4 legs running in the air with the autonomous efficiency of a machine, her jaw clamped shut, her eyes open and fixed on nothing. He went to her and put his hand on her rib cage and felt her heart driving at a rate that seemed unsustainable. He did not try to hold her still. He had enough knowledge of seizures, in dogs, in men, to know that restraint during the event accomplished nothing. 40 seconds, then stillness. She lay on her side, breathing in long, slow pulls, her eyes gradually refocusing. He stayed beside her on the floor for a long time afterward, which was not a practical choice, but was the only one available. Here is the thing about Pepper that Elias did not know. Sitting on the floor of his cabin on the 6th of February, 1935, she was not sick. Distemper is a viral disease. It requires a vector, contact with an infected animal, or shared water, or airborne transmission in close quarters. Pepper had not been in contact with another dog since October. She had not been in contact with any animal at all that was not dead and frozen by the time she encountered it. The symptoms Elias had attributed to distemper, the neurological progression, the coordination failures, the appetite loss, the seizure, were not symptoms of distemper. They were symptoms of strychnine poisoning. Strychnine was the standard poison bait used by Alaskan trappers and government predator control crews to kill wolves and wolverines throughout this era. It was mixed with fat or meat and placed in the carcass of a kill or directly on the snow near wolf sign. A lethal dose for a wolf was roughly 10 times the lethal dose for a dog of Pepper's size. The poison worked by blocking the neural inhibitory receptors in the spinal cord, causing uncontrolled muscle contractions. The seizure was not a symptom of brain disease but of a spinal cord firing without the off switch. On the far western end of Elias's trap line, in the section he ran least frequently in deep cold, he had placed 3 strychnine-laced wolf baits in October, standard practice, legal, documented in his territorial registration, something he had done every winter. He had placed them far enough from the main trap sets to avoid non-target catches. He had noted their positions in the log. What he had not noted, because he had not observed it, was that Pepper, on every trip around the western section while he was checking and resetting sets, had been consuming the bait. Not all at once. In small amounts over multiple visits, the accumulated dose building incrementally in her system over 2 months, each exposure adding to the last, the total approaching a lethal level slowly enough that each individual visit produced no immediate visible effect. She had been poisoning herself on his bait since November. He had put the poison there. He had walked her past it, over and over, while she ate it without his knowledge, and everything he had interpreted as illness, every symptom he had catalogued in the composition book, every calculation he had made about losing her, had a cause he could identify and stop if he knew it. He did not know it. He sat on the floor of the cabin with his hand on her rib cage, feeling her breathing slow to normal, and he believed he was watching his dog die of a disease, and there was no veterinarian and no medicine, and no one within 180 miles who could offer anything other than what he was already offering: presence, warmth, the particular helplessness of a person who has done everything correctly and is watching something die anyway. What he wrote in the composition book that evening was 3 words: cannot lose her. Then he closed the book and banked the stove and lay in the dark for a long time, doing the mathematics of a situation where the numbers did not resolve into a survivable outcome. Without Pepper, the sled ran only as far as he could pull it. Without the sled, the long trapline sections required packing everything on his back. Without a functional backhaul capacity for his catch and his supplies, the effective range of his operation collapsed to what he could carry out and return from in a single day. The cache was gone, the traps weren't working, the snare line was being systematically raided, the dog was dying, his food supply was measured in weeks, the temperature outside was minus 51 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping toward its nightly low. He had been in hard situations before. He had built a functional response to each of them, but those situations had been sequential. One problem, then another, each one arriving with enough spacing that he could address it before the next appeared. These were not sequential. They were simultaneous, and they were connected, and each one he could not solve made the others harder to address, in the compounding logic of a system failing not at one point, but at every point at once. He did not write any of this in the composition book. He lay in the dark and listened to Pepper breathe, and outside the cabin the temperature fell to -55 degrees Fahrenheit, and the spruce trees said nothing, and the snow said nothing, and the 19-hour night pressed against the walls with its full and indifferent weight. Was there a way out of this? He was up before 3. Not because he woke. He had not slept in any continuous sense, had drifted in and out of a shallow, unsatisfying semi-consciousness that left him more tired than waking would have. But because at some point in the long darkness he stopped pretending that lying still was useful and sat up and lit the lamp. Pepper was breathing. That was the first check, every time now. He sat on the edge of the bunk with the lamp on the floor between them and looked at her for a long time. The seizure had been 4 days ago. She had not had another. She was eating. Not well, not with her former efficiency, but eating. Which meant the strychnine logic he had not yet identified was being partially offset by the fact that she had not been to the western section in 9 days, meaning the accumulation had stopped even though the residual toxin in her system had not yet cleared. He did not know this. He saw only that she was slightly better. He opened the composition book and read back through his entries for the previous 6 weeks with the deliberate attention of a man looking for something he missed. He was not sure what he was looking for. He read the symptom entries, the dates, the trail observations, the weather records. He read the entry from November, noting that Pepper had been moving slowly on the return from the western loop, an observation he had attributed to the cold and recorded without follow-up. He read the December entry, noting that she had vomited once on the western trail, which he had attributed to something she had scavenged. He stopped at that entry. Scavenged. He had written the word and moved on because a dog scavenging on a trail was ordinary, expected, a behavioral constant he had long since stopped monitoring. But the western trail ran directly through the section where he had placed the wolf baits. 3 of them, positioned in October, marked in the log on a separate page, he turned to now and read carefully for the first time in months. The positions, the dates placed, the bait composition, rendered fat mixed with strychnine crystals packed into a rolled section of dried skin. He looked at the symptom entries again. He looked at the bait positions. He looked at Pepper. The connection assembled itself in under 30 seconds with the particular clarity of a thing that had been true the entire time. He was on his feet before the thought was fully formed, pulling on his outer layers with a speed that was not quite frantic, but had urgency in every movement. He did not stop to eat. He was outside in 4 minutes, moving west on the trail at a pace that the cold immediately began to tax, heading for the nearest of the 3 bait positions with Pepper's leash, a length of braided leather he almost never used, tied to her collar and held in his left hand. She followed readily, which told him she was better than yesterday. The nearest bait site was 40 minutes west. He reached it in 34, moving hard enough that sweat had begun to accumulate at his collar, which he registered and accepted as a calculated trade. The site was a depression between 2 spruce roots at the base of a large tree, an obvious, sheltered, animal-frequented spot, exactly where you placed wolf bait, exactly where a working dog following her owner's scent trail would investigate on every pass. The bait was gone. Not all of it. A dark smear remained on the spruce root where the fat had rested, frozen now into the wood, but lickable, had been licked. The surface of the smear showed the distinctive pattern of a tongue dragged across it in multiple passes. Not one visit, but many, accumulated over months, each visit consuming a small increment of the poison. He pulled out his hatchet and worked for 20 minutes in the -53 degrees Fahrenheit air, scraping the residue off the root and the surrounding snow, removing every accessible trace. His hands were already at the edge of useful function when he finished. He did not stop to warm them. He moved to the second bait site, 40 minutes further west. At the second site, he found wolverine tracks, fresh ones, last 24 hours by the sharpness of the edges in the cold, preserved snow. The wolverine that had been raiding his eastern section had moved west and found the bait before he got there. The bait was completely gone. The wolverine had consumed it, which meant the wolverine had consumed a dose of strychnine that, given its body weight, would likely kill it within 48 hours. He stood looking at the tracks for a moment. The wolverine that had destroyed 6 of his snare sets, that had cost him weeks of production and wire he couldn't replace, had just poisoned itself on his bait. He did not feel what he expected to feel about this. He moved to the third site. Removed the bait completely intact. This one had not been found by Pepper or the wolverine, sitting undisturbed under its covering of bark. He packed it in a separate piece of canvas, folded carefully, placed in the outer pocket of his pack away from food. He would dispose of it away from any trail. Walking back east, he ran the new numbers. Pepper's exposure had stopped. The residual toxin in her system would clear over 1 to 2 weeks based on what he knew about strychnine metabolism in dogs from the same Fort Yukon veterinary pamphlet that had sent him in the wrong diagnostic direction for the past 10 days. She would not recover immediately, but she would recover. Fully, probably, if the accumulation had not reached a critical threshold. The seizure suggested it had gotten close. The fact that there had been only one suggested it had not crossed. He would know within a week. That week was the hinge. Everything he decided in the next 7 days would determine whether he finished the winter on the line or began the 180-mile exit to Fort Yukon. He worked through the options on the walk back with the methodical discipline of a man who had no one to think out loud with and had therefore developed a very efficient internal process. Option 1. Stay the full season. Run the line through March as planned. This required Pepper to recover sufficiently to be useful within 2 weeks, required the snare line to continue producing despite the wolverine damage, and required his food stores, what remained of them, to last another 7 weeks at the current reduced intake. He did the math on the food. It was close. Dangerously close, but technically possible if he took another moose and the trapping improved. Option 2, begin the exit now in early February. The 180-mile journey to Fort Yukon by sled in this cold, with a dog not yet recovered, was a different category of risk than staying put. Moving through open country in extreme cold, camping on the trail for 6 to 8 nights, exposed without the shelter of the cabin, that was a journey people had not survived. The record at Fort Yukon contained names. There was a third option, one he had not yet fully articulated even to himself. He could contract, pull in the perimeter, abandon the far sections of the loop, the western branch, the outer, eastern sets, and concentrate entirely on the near sets, the hunting ground within 3 miles of the cabin, the small but manageable territory he could work without the dog, without full physical capacity, without burning the margin he needed to keep in reserve. Run a reduced operation for 6 more weeks, not a trapping operation of the original design, but a survival operation, a thing aimed not at profit but at making it to march alive. This meant abandoning most of the season's potential catch. It meant the winter would not pay. It meant the costs of the operation and the supplies, the equipment, the registration fees would not be covered by the revenue. He would leave in spring having spent more than he earned, which in the economics of a solo trapper was not a disaster in 1 year, but became one if it repeated. He had the conversation with himself about this on the trail home, laying it out and answering it the way a man will when he has been alone long enough that internal debate requires the same structure as spoken argument. The conclusion he reached was not complicated. He would contract. Starting the next morning, he would pull every snare from the western branch and the outer eastern section, leaving only the 22 sets within a manageable radius of the cabin. He would focus his energy on hunting, on maintaining Pepper's recovery, and on preparing the sled for a late February departure, 3 weeks earlier than planned, when the days would be slightly longer and the temperatures would have begun, incrementally, the movement towards something less absolute. He executed this plan with the particular efficiency of a man who had stopped negotiating with his situation. Over the next 4 days, he pulled the far sets, consolidated the wire into the near positions, and identified 3 active moose trails within 2 miles of the cabin. He found fresh moose sign on the second day. A bed, a recent one, the snow pressed flat and still retaining the faint warmth depression shape of the animal that had lain in it. And he built a hide from spruce boughs 30 yards from the bed and waited in it for 3 hours in -49 degrees Fahrenheit cold the following morning. The moose did not come that morning. It came the afternoon of the day after, while he was returning from a snare check on the near loop. Walked out of the spruce 50 yards ahead of him on the trail, a young bull moving with the slow, energy-conserving deliberateness of a large animal managing its winter reserves. Elias had the rifle up, and the shot placed before the animal registered him. 1 shot. Clean. The bull went down without moving from the trail. Processing took 3 hours and 40 minutes. He finished with full sensation in all fingers and both feet. The first time he had processed an animal in this cold without a close-call thermal incident. He was slower than he had been in October. He was also, by February standards, warmer. The caloric deficit had stabilized at a level that still cost him, but the moose meat would now push the food supply past the departure date with a margin he could actually trust. On the 9th day after removing the bait, Pepper ate her full ration. He watched her eat it, the particular focused intensity of a dog eating properly, head down, efficient, without the hesitant picking he had watched for weeks. And something in his chest did a thing that he did not record in the composition book. He noted only that she had eaten her full ration and that her gait on the afternoon trail check had shown no coordination irregularities. By the 14th day, she was running ahead of him again. Not at full strength. She was thinner, and she tired faster than before, and she still favored the left front paw on long sections. But she was running. She was at the front of the trail where she belonged, moving with the returning confidence of an animal whose nervous system was remembering how it was supposed to work. February 18th. He began preparing the sled for departure. The sled was a Yukon model, long, narrow, built for the open trail rather than dense forest, with a plank bed 5 feet long lashed to wooden runners with raw hide that he had relashed that fall with fresh material. He packed it over 3 days, making decisions about what to take and what to leave with the ruthlessness of a man who had spent the winter learning exactly how much he actually needed. He took the furs, 31 pelts, less than a third of what a full season should have produced, but real, sellable, worth something. He took the remaining food, the tools he could not replace, the composition book. The cast-iron stove he left, the photograph above it he left. The 4 remaining composition books, blank, he left. He was ready to leave on February 21st. 3 days out from the cabin, covering ground he knew well, in temperatures that had risen to a comparative -38 degrees Fahrenheit, under a sky that showed, for the first time since November, a thin blade of actual sunlight cutting low across the southern horizon. He looked at it. 6 hours later, something happened on the trail that he had not planned for and could not have anticipated. Something that stopped him in place and made him stand in the middle of the frozen river ice and look at what he had almost walked past for the 4th time that winter. The sticks were cut from green willow. That was the first thing he noticed. The specific yellow-green color of fresh-cut willow against the grey-white of the river ice, vivid enough to register as wrong in a landscape that had spent 4 months draining itself of color. 3 sticks, each about 18 inches long, driven into the snow at the river's edge in a tight cluster. The top of each stick had been notched. 1 cut on the first, 2 on the second, 3 on the third. And they were angled not vertically, but at roughly 45 degrees, all pointing in the same upstream direction. He had passed this spot before. He knew he had passed it. The river trail to Fort Yukon ran directly through here, and he had used this section 11 times over the winter on various loop approaches that touched the river ice before heading back into the trees. 11 times. He had seen these sticks, or sticks like them, on at least 4 of those passes and registered them as debris, as natural deadfall caught upright in a pressure ridge, as the kind of visual noise a winter landscape produced in quantity. They were not debris. He stood looking at them for a long time, long enough that Pepper circled back from 20 yards ahead and sat beside him, reading his stillness as information. The Koyukon Athabaskan people of interior Alaska had developed a trail communication system over centuries of living in exactly the conditions Elias was navigating, a system for leaving messages on routes where 2 people might pass months apart and never overlap in person. The system used cut sticks placed at specific heights, angles, and groupings to convey information: direction of travel, whether a camp was nearby, whether the person leaving the message needed assistance, whether the route ahead was safe. The notch count indicated distance or time. The angle indicated heading. Elias had been told about this system in his first year by a Koyukon man at the Fort Yukon trading post, told about it in practical terms as useful information for anyone working these trails. He had listened with the attention he gave to all practical information. He had never learned to read it because he had never expected to need to read it, because he had organized his understanding of his winter around the assumption that he was alone out here. 3 sticks. Upstream angle. 1 notch, 2 notches, 3 notches. He did not know what this meant. He knew it meant something. He knew it had been placed by a human hand, deliberately, on a trail he used, and that whoever placed it had expected someone to read it. He reached Fort Yukon on the afternoon of the 4th day. The trading post sat on the south bank of the Yukon, a cluster of log buildings that from a distance looked like something the river had deposited rather than built. Low, dark, embedded in the landscape rather than standing above it. Smoke from 4 chimneys. The smell of it reached him a full mile before the buildings came into view, and the smell of wood smoke from a settlement, the particular density of it, the layered complexity of many fires rather than one. was a thing he felt in his body before his mind processed it. He had not smelled another person's fire in 5 months. The trader's name was Beaumont, a large, deliberate man in his 50s who had been running this post for 23 years and who had the specific quality of attentiveness that came from decades of reading men who arrived from the wilderness. He looked at Elias when he came through the door, looked at him the way a doctor looks at a patient who has walked in under their own power, but is clearly operating on reserves, and said nothing about what he saw. He put coffee on. Elias sat at the counter and put his hands flat on the wood surface, feeling the smoothness of milled lumber under his palms, the particular solidity of a surface that had been built to last and was warm. His hands did not look like his hands. They looked like tools that had been used past their maintenance cycle, knuckles enlarged, skin cracked across the joints in 3 places that had healed and re-cracked through the winter. The left index finger bent at the second joint from a freeze incident in January that had left the tendons slightly shortened. He told Beaumont the basic outline of the winter in the way trappers reported at trading posts. Practical, sequential, without elaboration. The cold event, the cache, the dog. Beaumont listened and refilled the coffee and asked one specific question. Had he seen the stick markers on the river above the second bend? Elias said he had. He said he had not been able to read them. Beaumont told him what they said. 2 trappers had wintered on lines that ran within 30 miles of Elias's cabin, one named Henrik Strand, running a line out of a cabin on the north side of the Kandik drainage, and one whose name Beaumont gave as Charlie Tritt, a Koyukon man who had trapped this country his entire life and whose family had trapped it for generations before him. Both men had known from territorial registration maps that another trapper was working the flats nearby. Both had placed message sticks on the shared river trail through the winter, markers indicating their presence, their direction of travel, and, in Charlie Tritt's case, a specific set of sticks in late January indicating that he had a camp on the river and was available to any traveler passing through. In late January, Elias had been blind. He had passed that camp marker 4 days into his blindness, moving by memory down a trail he could not see, and had not registered the sticks because he could not see them. He had passed Strand's directional markers in December, in November, in early February, passed them at least 7 times total, registering nothing, because the language they were written in was one he had never learned. He had not been alone. He had believed he was alone with the absolute conviction of a man whose entire experience confirmed the belief. But within 30 miles, a distance that in a less extreme environment would constitute neighborly proximity, 2 other human beings had spent the same winter, faced the same cold, survived the same dark, and had been trying, in the only way the logistics of that world allowed, to make contact. Beaumont told him one more thing, and this was the thing that settled into Elias differently than the rest. Charlie Tritt had checked on Elias's cabin site in January, had made a deliberate detour on his loop to pass within visual range of the cabin, not stopping, not intruding, but confirming that smoke was coming from the chimney. In the communication economy of the interior, smoke from a chimney in winter was the fundamental signal. Still here, still alive. Tritt had seen the smoke and continued on his way, and left a marker at the next river crossing indicating that the flats cabin was occupied and active. He had been checking. Without Elias knowing. Without Elias asking. Because that was how the world out here worked for the people who actually knew how to live in it, not in the isolation that Elias had believed he had chosen, but in a loose, silent, watchful web of attention that required no conversation and no arrangement and no acknowledgement to function. Elias sat with this information for a while. Beaumont assessed the furs, 31 pelts, marten, mink, 1 lynx taken in a snare in early January, graded and priced with the brisk efficiency of a man who had been doing this since Elias was a child. The total came to $84. The cost of Elias's supplies for the season, food, hardware, fuel, the registration fee, had been $91, $7 short of breaking even. A full winter's work, every risk he had run, every calculation he had made and remade, and made again in the dark of a February cabin. And he had finished $7 below the line. Beaumont noted this without ceremony and extended the difference as credit against the following season's account. The frostbite assessment came next, conducted by Beaumont with the competence of a man who had seen a great deal of it. Elias's left index finger, the one with the shortened tendon, showed permanent thickening at the second joint. 3 toes on his left foot had mild blistering that had already begun to resolve. The patch on his left cheek, damaged in November, had survived the winter without deepening. The prognosis, in Beaumont's estimation, was full function with minor permanent sensitivity to cold in the affected areas. He had made it through with all his pieces. The physical recovery began quickly once he was warm and fed properly. The weight he had lost, Beaumont's scale put it at 41 pounds below his September departure weight, came back faster than expected, the body recognizing the return of adequate nutrition with the urgency of a system that had been managing a crisis for months. Within 2 weeks at the post, the morning trembling in his hands had stopped. His sleep consolidated back into 7-hour blocks. The peripheral haziness in his vision from the snow blindness cleared completely by mid-March. Pepper recovered alongside him. Given full rations and no further strychnine exposure, her neurological symptoms resolved within 3 weeks of reaching Fort Yukon. By March, she was running the dog yard at the post with her original authority, establishing her position in the hierarchy of Beaumont's work dogs with the focused efficiency of an animal that had survived something without needing to understand what it was. In April, Charlie Tritt came in from his line. He was a compact, unhurried man in his 40s, whose face showed the specific quality of someone who had spent decades in this landscape and arrived at an accommodation with it that was neither romantic nor grim. He and Elias sat at Beaumont's counter and communicated through the narrow channel available to 2 men with limited shared language, practical information exchanged in the efficient shorthand of people who understood that the most important facts were also the simplest ones. Tritt showed him the stick system, demonstrated it on the counter with pieces of kindling, the angles, the notch counts, the specific combinations that carried specific meanings. Elias learned it in 30 minutes. It was not complicated. It had never been complicated. The complexity had been entirely in his assumption that it wasn't there to learn. The spring of 1935 arrived in the Yukon flats with the particular violence of a northern thaw, not gradual, not gentle, but sudden and total, the river ice going out in a single weekend of cracking and grinding that sounded like the entire season breaking up at once. The melt revealed the landscape beneath the winter in installments, the snow retreating to expose tundra grasses still flattened from the weight of 5 months of coverage, and then the first green, impossibly vivid against the brown and grey, and then the geese coming north in formations that crossed overhead for 3 days straight. Elias watched the river go out from Beaumont's porch. He had a decision to make that he had been making and unmaking since February, whether to return in the fall. The practical case against it was straightforward. The winter had not paid, his body had absorbed damage it would carry permanently, and the knowledge of how close certain moments had been was the kind of knowledge that changed how a man assessed risk. The practical case for it was equally straightforward. He knew the line now in a way he had not known it before the winter, knew its failure points and its possibilities, and he had two neighbors he could actually find if the situation required it. What he wrote in the composition book in late April, sitting at Beaumont's counter, was not a decision either way. It was an inventory. What he had come in with in September, what he had left the cabin with in February. What was different between those two lists? Not in equipment, not in food, but in what he knew that he had not known before. The list of what he now knew was long. It covered 4 pages. He filled them carefully in the small, precise handwriting he used when he wanted the words to last, and when he finished he read it back and found it accurate and closed the book. He had one question he could not answer from where he was sitting. He had passed those message sticks 11 times. He had been watched over silently by a man he had not met through the hardest winter of his life. He had survived partly, he now understood, because Charlie Tritt had seen the smoke and kept moving and said nothing and left a marker that Elias could not read, and the question that had no answer was what would have happened in late January, at the worst of it, if that chimney had gone cold. Elias Cord returned to the line in September 1935. He restocked the cabin, rebuilt the cache in a new location with better drainage, and learned to read the permafrost before trusting it by probing with a steel rod rather than assuming. He replaced every steel trap on the line with a model rated for extreme cold, a design modification another trapper had told him about at the post, a simple change in spring composition that cost 40 cents more per trap and worked at -70 degrees Fahrenheit. He marked his bait sites in the composition book against a map with dates and distances, and he planned Pepper's trail routes so she never passed within a quarter mile of any of them. He also learned 37 stick combinations from Charlie Tritt before freeze-up. The second winter was hard. Every winter in that country was hard. But it was hard in the ordinary way, and the cold was cold, the dark was dark, the work was relentless, and the margin was thin, rather than in the compounding systemic way that the winter of 1934 had been hard. He came out in March with 114 pelts and a profit of $63, and the left side of his face slightly more weathered than the right, which it would remain for the rest of his life. He wintered the line for 9 more years after that. The last entry in the final composition book he filled at the cabin was dated October 1944. It recorded the condition of the trapline, the state of the cache, the first temperatures of the season, Pepper's age. She was 12 by then, which was elderly for a working dog, moving slower on the trail, but still insisting on being at the front of it. The entry was 4 paragraphs. The last line noted that the river had begun to skim at the edges, which meant freeze-up was 2 weeks out. He did not come out of the line the following spring. Beaumont sent word to the territorial office in Fairbanks in May, when the mail carrier returned from the flats without having found Elias at the cabin for supply pickup. A search party reached the cabin in June, after the trails were passable. They found the stove still set up, the tools in their positions, the composition books on the shelf. They found evidence that Elias had gone out on the line in early December and had not returned, a packed sled, partially loaded, positioned near the door as though he had been preparing for a long trip, and had simply not come back from whatever he had gone out to check first. They searched the line for 3 days. They found nothing. No body, no equipment, no disturbance in the snow that told the story clearly. The snow had been over it too long by June. Whatever had happened in December or January, in the full depth of winter, in a place where the wilderness could absorb an event completely and leave no record that any instrument of the living could read. His name remained on the territorial registration for the trap line for 4 years after that, because no one filed the paperwork to remove it. Other trappers passing through the area left the cabin alone. A custom of the interior, unwritten, that another man's cabin stayed intact until the man himself, or someone who knew him, said otherwise. The door stayed unlocked, as all backcountry cabins stayed unlocked, available to any traveller in need. The photograph above the stove stayed on the wall. It was still there in 1953, when a survey crew working for the territorial government used the cabin for 2 nights and noted it in their field report. A photograph of a woman and 2 children in front of a white house, the image faded but intact, nailed above a stove that had not been fired in 8 years. The surveyor who noted it did not know whose photograph it was or why it was there. He recorded it because it seemed worth recording. An image of people who did not belong to this place, preserved by the cold in a cabin at the edge of the world, lasting longer than the man who had put it there. What Elias Cord's winters produced, beyond the pelts and the entries in the composition books, was not visible at the time and took decades to accumulate into something nameable. The Alaska Mental Health Act of 1956, a piece of legislation that established the first formal mental health infrastructure in the territory, was built partly on case documentation of what prolonged isolation did to settlers, trappers, and homesteaders in the interior. The case files that informed it included accounts from men like Elias, men who had functioned at extraordinary levels of physical competence while simultaneously experiencing the documented psychological erosion of months without human contact, without social reference points, without the basic neurological input that human beings required to maintain a stable sense of reality. The legislators who wrote the act had never trapped a line, but the data they used came directly from the people who had. Survival psychology as a formal discipline, as the study of how human beings make decisions, maintain function, and sometimes fail under extreme stress, drew heavily from exactly this era and exactly these conditions. The specific findings that researchers documented in Alaskan trapper case studies shaped protocols that are still in use, in polar research stations, in long-duration spaceflight planning, in the design of solitary confinement reform standards. The insight that social isolation damaged cognitive function in measurable, predictable ways, that it was not a character weakness but a physiological process, came substantially from the written records of men like Elias, who had kept composition books because they needed the structure and had inadvertently produced scientific data. Charlie Tritt trapped his line until 1961. He outlasted the territorial period entirely, was present when Alaska became a state in 1959, and was interviewed by a university anthropologist in 1963 about traditional trail communication methods. The interview transcript, held in an archive in Fairbanks, runs to 41 pages. In it, Tritt described the stick system in precise technical detail and also described briefly the winter of 1934 and the trapper in the flats cabin whose chimney he had checked and found smoking and had not stopped to visit, because stopping uninvited was not how things were done, and the smoke meant the man was managing. He mentioned this as a detail, not as a significant event. In his accounting of that winter, it occupied 2 sentences. The last registered solo trapline operator in the Yukon Flats region, a man who worked a shortened version of Elias's original route, filed his final seasonal report in 1987. By then, the fur market had collapsed under the pressure of synthetic alternatives and shifting public attitudes toward animal pelts, and the economic basis that had drawn men like Elias to the interior had ceased to function. The trap lines did not disappear. They still exist on territorial maps, some of them, the old registrations, never formally voided. But the men who ran them did, quietly, over a decade, without announcement. The techniques those men developed did not disappear with them. The layered clothing system that Elias used, the principle of multiple thin layers over a single heavy one, each layer serving a specific thermal function, the whole assembly designed to be adjusted rather than removed, is the foundation of every modern cold-weather gear system from mountaineering to military cold-weather operations. The nutritional understanding that came from studying what worked and what didn't in extreme cold caloric deficits shaped the ration design of polar expeditions from the 1950s onward. The insight about moving slowly enough not to sweat, which Elias practiced, has received wisdom from older trappers, is taught today in wilderness survival courses as one of the 3 foundational rules of cold weather travel. The coldest permanently inhabited research station on Earth, operated by Russian scientists at Vostok in Antarctica, uses a daily routine that would be recognizable to a man who wintered in the Yukon Flats in 1934. Fixed departure and return times, mandatory buddy checks, specific protocols for managing solo movement in extreme temperatures. The understanding that in that kind of cold process was survival and improvisation was a last resort.
None of this is named after anyone. None of it carries a credit. It is simply the accumulated knowledge of people who went to the far edge of what human beings could sustain and came back, or didn't come back. And either way, left something behind in the record. Now consider what the opening of this story looked like from the other side. A man in a doorway, 4 minutes, a buckle he could not close. The decision to walk 400 yards in minus 68 degrees Fahrenheit air to a trap he was already 11 days late checking. The calculation that made him step outside rather than step back. At the time, that calculation appeared to be about a trap, about the possibility of a marten pelt worth $3 to $5, about the economics of a season that was already compromised and needed every possible unit of production. It was not about any of those things. It was about the 47 trap sets he had walked 11,000 miles to place over 3 years. It was about the composition books on the shelf, filling with the record of a life conducted at the exact scale he had been looking for since he came home from France in 1919, with nothing damaged on the outside and everything rearranged within. It was about Pepper, sitting in the snow 10 yards out, watching him with one blue eye and one brown one, waiting to learn whether they were going or staying. It was about the particular quality of agency that remained available to a man in an impossible situation. Not the ability to change the situation, but the ability to keep moving through it with the same deliberate attention that had gotten him this far. He got the buckle, he stepped outside, he walked the 400 yards and found the empty trap and reset it and walked back. He did this through 5 winters before he did not come back. No one knows what the 6th winter looked like from inside it. No one knows what the last entry in the last composition book said, because the last composition book was never found.
No one knows whether he saw it coming or whether it arrived, like most things in that country, without warning and without the courtesy of an explanation. What is known is that the chimney went cold sometime in the winter of 1944, and Charlie Tritt's eyes were on a different section of sky and the smoke that had been the signal, still here, still alive, was no longer there to read. And the photograph stayed on the wall. The woman and 2 children in front of the White House, squinting into summer sun, belonging to no one in that cabin, lasting longer than anything else he had put there, lasting past the man himself, past the season that took him, past the slow reclamation of the wilderness over everything he had built. The cold preserves things. That is one of its few mercies. It takes much, and it takes without negotiation, and it does not return what it takes. But what it does not take, it keeps, exactly as it was, for longer than seems possible, in a cabin on the edge of the world where the door stays unlocked and the fire has been out for years, and the temperature inside has long since equalized with the temperature outside, which was always in the end what the cold wanted. Some mornings in February at roughly 67 degrees north latitude, the sun rises for a few hours and clears the southern ridgeline, just enough to throw a thin, orange, practically heatless light across the spruce tops and down onto the snow. And for a brief time, the snowfield south of where the cabin stood catches that light and holds it. Flat, brilliant, every surface reflecting back at every other surface, the way it did on the night of January 18th, 1935, when a man stepped outside without his eye protection and stood in the moonlight for 11 minutes and paid for it for a week. The light does not ask whether anyone is there to see it. It arrives, and it illuminates whatever is present, and it moves on.